Hello everyone, how are we doing? So, in this video, we're going to begin going into the respiratory system, and here we're going to be focused on the respiratory system structures and their functions. And then in the second video, we're going to go into how we breathe and the process of breathing. And then in the last video, we're going to go into how we control breathing, how it's regulated, and how we transport oxygen and CO2 in our body. All right, first up here, we have to understand the structures going on in the respiratory system, and so that's what we're going to go into. Here's the general overview. Of course, you breathe in. You have your nasal cavity and oral cavity up here that all passes through what's known as the pharynx, which is the area in the back. From here on up, this is known as the upper respiratory tract, and then from here down, that's the lower respiratory tract. So we kind of break it up. We travel down the trachea then into the right and the left lung. There's a little branch here called the carina, and then you split into the different lobes and so forth of each lung. Of course, you have your ribs around the lungs, and the diaphragm is the muscle down below, and the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm all assist in the mechanism of breathing then. So that is the focus here today. So here, first talking about the upper respiratory tract, which includes the nasal cavity, pharynx, and the larynx. So, the whole purpose of the nasal cavity when you breathe in, so air is a gas, and gas, in order to move into our body, has to dissolve in a liquid. So, when we breathe this air in, we want to moisten and humidify that air. In Florida, it's not as much of an issue, but you want to do that so you can dissolve it better. Also, that's how smell works. That's responsible for olfaction. But that air comes in, and so the nasal mucosa in here, high capillaries, and also when you exhale, you reclaim that heat to help keep your body warm too. And then all this back here, this is the pharynx. All of this region is the pharynx. Is broken up into the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx down here. So it kind of has three regions to it. And then as air moves down through, it then moves through that pharynx. So, like I said, it has those three parts to it. So, this is passageway for both air and food. And now we get to the division here. So, down here is where we get to the larynx. So, the larynx is just referring to the voice box right here. Now, the voice box has what are called the vocal folds in it and so forth. So, when you're swallowing food, you want it to go down the esophagus and not the trachea. So you don't want food to go there. So there's a structure here called the epiglottis, which closes. So whenever you swallow food, there's an automatic reflex which closes the glottis. It covers the trachea so that food goes down the esophagus. But every now and then mistakes happen and you cough it up. So that's the upper respiratory tract for the larynx. Larynx is your voice box, and so that's where your vocal cords are. I'm using those now as air comes out. They vibrate at different intensities. Then we get to the lower respiratory tract, which begins with the trachea, lungs, and the bronchi. So air is coming down the trachea. Now, you can go into all the different cartilaginous rings that are found up here in the larynx region, but we're not going to get into crazy detail on that. Males have a larger laryngeal prominence right here, and that's known as the Adam's apple. And that kind of shows where the bottom of the larynx is. And below that, you have the trachea, which is nice round shape held, and it keeps that shape by these tracheal cartilage rings, and it's made up of hyaline cartilage. There's also a muscle in there called the trachealis muscle, which, if you're coughing, it's what's contracting. Um, and then this is just a very simple breakdown. As the air comes down through, it goes two different ways. These are known, so this separation right there is the carina of the trachea. And then we go either direction, and those are then the primary bronchi. And then we get to the secondary bronchi. So we have technically three over here. So this would be one, and then this would be another one right there. So those are all secondary. And then here would be the secondary for the left lung. Now, the left lung, this is not an accurate representation. That's why I was a little confused there. Is smaller. Not really smaller, but it has one less lobe, and I'll show that in an image coming up. But then it goes to the secondary, and then these smaller ones are tertiary bronchi. So primary, secondary, tertiary for third, or first order, second order, third order. So as they get smaller, when you go down more branches. So here, this is the more accurate representation right here. So you got the primary, so main primary bronchus, and then you get the secondary lobar bronchi, or a bronchus is a singular one. So here would be, 1, 2, 3. And here you see an inferior, a middle, and a superior lobe, whereas over here you only see an inferior lobe and a superior lobe. So only 2 lobes in the left lung and 3 lobes in the right. The reason for that is the heart is located right here, and this is called the cardiac notch. The heart points into the left lobe just a little bit. But as you get down smaller, you get then to the segmental or tertiary, which are the very small ones. And then you get to the bronchioles, which are the very, very small tubes. So these are all tubes moving down through, and we get to the bronchioles, and from the bronchioles you finally, no gas exchange has taken place yet. Right now all these are our roadways for air, CO2 and oxygen to move in and out of the lungs. Gas exchange takes place at structures called the alveoli. And so here we have what's known as a terminal bronchiole, which starts coming down, and then it branches into the final respiratory bronchioles. So here, these respiratory bronchioles then go into these sacs that look like grapes, and these are called alveolar sacs. And if you look at these, air can move through all of these little sacs, and they're surrounded by all of these capillaries. A singular ball on this is known as an alveolus. So alveoli would be plural then. So gas exchange is taking place in these alveolar sacs, and these are expanding and unexpanding or contracting. They don't really contract, but they are, deflating with every breath of air that you take. So what are the cells that are in the walls of these sacs? So they have to be very thin. You're exchanging oxygen and CO2, and you want that to happen quickly. If it's a thick layer of cells, it's bad. If you remember back in the histology chapters, we talked about a tissue called simple squamous. So this is a good example of simple squamous tissue, which is a single cell layer thick. Now so here is that single cell layer. So flattened scale-like cells. And then here are all the capillaries moving through around those cells, and these are little alveolar pores where air can move through all the different alveoli. Now, gas exchange is taking place between those cells right there. So you have an exchange. CO2 is leaving the body. So your body produces CO2 from cellular respiration. It's the byproduct. And then you inhale oxygen that then goes to your tissues to power cellular respiration. It's that final electron acceptor in the mitochondria. But now in these alveoli, we have 2 types of cells. We have a type 1 alveolar cell, which is where we have gas exchange happening between the alveoli and the capillaries. And then we have a type 2 alveolar cells. These produce a substance called surfactant. So surfactant is this protein lipid substance that reduces the cohesion and adhesion of water. And what that means is, so water is polar. Polar means it can stick to itself and stick to its surroundings pretty easily. And the polarity of water can actually cause alveoli to collapse because that's just the water pulling in. It pulls in the walls, and these very thin, simple squamous walls will actually collapse. Surfactant reduces that surface tension. So surface tension is like a water strider floating on water. If you reduce that surfactant, if you reduce that surface tension, then it doesn't pull on the walls as much. So that's what surfactant does. Sometimes artificial surfactant needs to be given to a newborn if their lungs aren't properly inflating, because if surfactant is not being produced at birth, the lungs will collapse after every breath. And you don't want these alveoli to collapse, because then you're not getting gas exchange. So gases then exchange. But what are some other important parts here? We talked about the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a large muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity, but it's also the main muscle for breathing. We'll talk about how when the diaphragm moves down, it causes the thoracic cavity to expand, and then air runs in. We'll talk about the mechanisms of breathing in the next video. And then your intercostal muscles. You have external and internal intercostal muscles, which also assist in breathing. And those, all it is expanding that thoracic cage, making it larger, and then the unique thing about the lungs, if you ever put two microscope slides together, they stick together. And lungs are kind of like that because of the pleura. The pleura are the little serous membranes that they're in. So there's a lining directly on, so right here's the lung. There's a membrane directly on the lung. It's called the visceral pleura. Then there's a space. It's called the pleural cavity. And then there's a parietal pleura. So this space here is filled with a fluid called serous fluid. And when the lungs expanding, this is like the two slides sticking together, the lungs stick to the wall. So when your thoracic cavity expands, your lungs expand as well and then open up a pressure difference. They'll allow air to rush in. So we'll talk about that more on the next video. But you can sometimes get inflammation in this cavity right here. It's called pleurisy, pretty painful. If there's ever any damage to this area, that can lead to the lungs to collapse because then the pressure from outside will be pushing down the lungs. The lungs are very, very delicate. They're very soft tissue. So if there's any pressure difference that, like we'll talk about in an upcoming video, they will collapse. Lung collapse is pneumothorax because of air being introduced, or atelectasis is just overall lung collapse. And then there are some accessory structures here. I mentioned the epiglottis. The epiglottis we talked about earlier as being responsible for covering the glottis, which is the opening to the trachea. The glottis is the opening, epiglottis is the flap, so that food doesn't come down. If you recall, that is made of elastic cartilage. And then in the lining of the trachea, it's heavily ciliated. So this is pseudostratified columnar epithelia, and we have all these cilia here. These cilia are moving back and forth, these little hairs, and it's known as your ciliary escalator, bringing mucus up and out of the lungs. Smoking actually causes a breakdown of these cilia, and that's why smokers eventually develop what's known as a smoker's cough, because they have to cough the mucus out rather than the cilia bringing the mucus and debris up and out of your lungs, which you're constantly making from breaking down the bacteria you're breathing in. Mucus then is the moist lining. It's lubricating substance and very important part of your respiratory tract, and that's produced by goblet cells and also some seromucous glands deeper down in here. But these goblet cells are releasing mucin, dissolves in an aqueous environment, and then becomes mucus. But this video here was just a little introductory video to this chapter, going over the major structures of the respiratory system. Now we're going to dive into the system a little bit more and learn how breathing takes place in the physiology of regulation and gas transport. All right, see you next time. Bye-bye.